What do you make of this decision by health officials? Do you think this is the right approach to take, and should we be replicating it over here?
Well, this is actually mirrored by what we're doing in the UK at the moment, that we've dropped it down to 7 days. And the difference between the 7 day approach that we're using in the UK and the 5 days in the US is actually based on the fact that we are better at identifying COVID earlier. And therefore, we do need the extra 2 days, because we'll find the couple of days that we will identify it before the US do. But as the CDC says, the most infectious period is in the first 48 hours after you develop COVID. So the vast majority of people, the infectivity rates start to fall after that 48-hour period. And then providing we test negative from the lateral flow test, which again is a really good way of finding out what your viral load is in your throat and in your nose, then it's a good time to be re-engaging with the population. However, the caveat is that everybody who's tested positive at some point should go back on to wearing their mask and make sure that they are actually only engaging with people as they need to, rather than as they would like to. And I think that's the important gap here. If you're wearing your mask and you're out and about, that's one thing, but it's not still particularly safe to be getting into the nightclubs, to be getting into the bars, and to be mixing until we've reached the 10-day period.
So are you suggesting that you're broadly in favour of the reduction of the isolation period, and that, in the past when we've been told that it's 10 days since we've had the symptoms that we need to isolate, that has been maybe a little bit over-cautious? Is that right?
So these are all changing data. With the Omicron variant, we've seen that the number of virus that you create rises very, very rapidly. It's a 70-fold increase in the amount of virus that you produce. But with this very rapid rise, there is also a more rapid decline. So the infectious period with the Omicron variant is actually shorter than it was with the Delta. So you are far more infectious for a short time, but actually the infectivity starts to decline. And in the UK, we've already seen a move that we've dropped from 10 days down to 7 days. And again, this is all based on the newer data from the newer variant, rather than we got it wrong, because with the original variant and the Alpha variant, we were still seeing people very infectious for a 10 or 12-day period. With the Delta variant, that dropped down to the 7 to 10 days. Now we're seeing it in the 5 to 7 days is your infectious time.
So given the new data that's come in about the Omicron variant, and it seems to be wonderful news insofar as, yes, as you point out, it's far more transmissible. We're all probably going to get it at some point. But nevertheless, when we do get it, the symptoms are relatively mild, and it's nowhere near as severe as Delta or previous incarnations of the virus. So do you think there is a case at all for revisiting the concept of herd immunity, or the idea that perhaps we should open up society, let the virus run its course, and in a sense, we all have the advantage of a kind of free vaccination?
So when it comes to the Omicron variant, if you are already double vaccinated and boosted, you're absolutely right. The hospitalizations are much lower. The case fatality rate is much lower. But it's important to say that we're in a different scenario than we were 12 months ago. And for people who are still unvaccinated, this is still a horrendous disease. And I'm seeing people on a daily basis who are unvaccinated, who are presented with both Delta and Omicron variant, and who are still very rapidly ending up in ITU. And remember, we still have about 15% of our population that still haven't had their vaccine. The other important caveat is if you get COVID plus any other disease, it makes whatever the other disease is much worse. So if you're going for an operation, your mortality and your complication rate is about twice as high. If you have a heart attack, your risk of getting heart failure is about twice as high. And that's the real risk of COVID as it stands at the moment, not of dying of COVID itself, but of the fact that if you've got COVID and any other disease, it is going to get worse. And as long as we can continue getting the vaccine out there, then there will come a time, and hopefully the next iteration of COVID will be one that is a lot less severe. So we're hoping that Pi, Rho, Sigma, Tau will become successively less severe diseases. And then eventually we will end up in a position that COVID becomes nothing more than the next series of common colds, and we can just get on with our life as normal. I don't think we're there yet, but that is definitely the way that we're heading.
Well, thanks for that. That's very clearly expressed. And from what I understand it, as we move through the Greek alphabet, it runs like any other virus and becomes weaker and weaker as it goes along, which is fantastic news. But given what you've just outlined in terms of the risks that are involved, firstly, if you're not vaccinated, but also if you have other conditions, is there an argument that we should do our best to inform people of those risks, but then give them the onus of choice? In other words, once everybody in the country knows about this, we can open up society. If you've chosen not to get vaccinated, you've taken that risk, you've taken that choice, and the repercussions will fall on you. Is there a case there?
There is very definitely, we are heading in that direction, and we're going to see that on New Year's Eve, that people who choose to go to parties without a vaccination on the basis of a negative lateral flow test. I mean, if you're doing that in London, every 1 in 20 people is infected. So if you're doing that in London and you're unvaccinated, chances are you are going to come home with COVID and you are going to end up really, really sick. However, the important caveat is there are still the vulnerable, the immunocompromised, the elderly living within our community that even though they've been vaccinated, the vaccine doesn't work quite as well. And that's where the real ethical debate lies, because if we do fully open up society, we are putting an entire group of our vulnerable elderly patients back into a place where the only safe place for them is in isolation. And remember, the entire society is judged on how we treat our elderly, how we treat our vulnerable. And therefore, I don't think we're at a position yet where we can say, you take your choice and you do this, because this is not just you that's taking the risk. It's this very vulnerable elderly cohort that we need to be concerned about.
And finally, do you foresee a time when isolation will be scrapped altogether and we won't go back to this? Do you think that's ever going to be possible? I think a lot of people have this fear, what with talk of further booster jabs and further lockdowns, that this is going to be a kind of never-ending cycle. And I think people are really afraid of that and the implications for civil liberties. Do you share those concerns or have any sympathy with them?
I have a lot of sympathy with them. I, like many other people, I want to get back to life as normal. I want to have friends over. I want to go out to the pub again. But I don't think we are quite there yet. There is a lot of work at the moment looking at an Omicron-specific vaccine. One of the problems is the vaccine to the original variant is only giving us 2 to 3 months worth of protection against Omicron. So we're going to end up in this cycle of every 2 to 3 months that we'll end up needing a booster in order to reduce the transmission. When we start getting Omicron-specific variants, or ideally, when the virus starts to mutate into a less severe illness that doesn't have these carryover effects, it doesn't cause long COVID, it doesn't cause a higher risk when you're operated on or when you have another disease, that's the point that we can really let our guard go. That's the point we can get out, we can start having parties again, and we can start enjoying society at its fullest. But at the moment, when it comes to, I mean, particularly for healthcare workers, it becomes impossible for a healthcare worker to enjoy their New Year's party, knowing that we are going to go back into work tomorrow and potentially infect our patients who are already at high risk for other people. And this is the position that we're in at the moment. I, like everyone else, really want to get back to normality. I want to go to the bar. I want to get out and party again, but we're not quite there yet.